Bretislav is a molecular physicist of some renown who has a long career of working on the dynamics of molecular collisions, the effects of electric and magnetic fields on the collisions. These are subjects which are essential to astronomers. And one reason is that he is collaborating with groups at the Smithsonian Astronomical Observatory. He's also collaborating with physicists at Harvard, chemists too, but particularly with John Doyle. The two of them have pioneered a really fascinating and fast-growing field, the field of ultra-cold molecules. So he is heavily immersed in the research community, but he has a second profession too. He is a very distinguished historian of science. I got to know him well a few years ago when he co-sponsored a celebration of the Stern-Gerlach experiment, the centenary of it, at the university where it was first done at Frankfurt. That has been published now in an open access book, which is a wonderful new institution. Namely, you can get books from Springer for free. And it's filled with interesting articles on not only Otto Stern himself, but those around him. That's just one example. He has also founded, with a colleague, a new open access journal by Wiley. So he is a versatile person. He is the research group leader emeritus at the Molecular Physics Department of the Fritz Haber Institute of the Max Planck Society in Berlin, an honorary professor at the Technical University Berlin. Besides his research in molecular physics, he maintains an abiding interest in the history of science, the emergence of quantum mechanics, the rise of physics and theoretical chemistry, scientific biography, and is engaged in efforts to eliminate chemical and other weapons of mass destruction. With a keen interest in scientific publishing, Bretislav Friedrich has served in a variety of editorial researches prior to assuming his current position as academic executive editor of Wiley's flagship open science journals, Natural Science. He also serves as the founding editor of the Springer series, History of Physics. He has collaborated with many people. His longest and perhaps most fruitful collaboration has been with Dudley Hirschbach at Harvard. And he has spent considerable periods of time working with Dudley at Harvard. Let me just quote one incident he mentioned in his autobiography. At Harvard, he discovered that one of the treasures of the physics department there is the physics department library. It is a wonderful library. I've spent time there myself. He spent a lot of time and he discovered a secret that in a room adjacent to the library, there was a collection of very early papers. And he became fascinated with those papers. And that was a major impetus in his current interest in the history of science. So now let me turn the floor over to Bretislav. Bretislav, you can take it from here.
Dan, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for this introduction, which makes me blush. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope I will have to say something of interest to you. The talk is focused on a relationship between two very special people, Fritz Haber and Chaim Weizmann. They were both prominent German-speaking Jewish chemists with rather divergent views on Jewish assimilation and Zionism that only converged upon the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. The first contact between Fritz Haber and Chaim Weizmann was indirect, but somewhat cataclysmic. They just started on the wrong foot with one another. It would take nearly 12 years and the mediation of their family members who knew each other professionally for the two men to meet, to close the distance between them and to meet face to face. When they finally did in 1932 in London, they quickly warmed up to each other. From then on, a rather congenial relationship had developed between Haber and Weizmann that is documented in 29 letters exchanged between them, as well as in their correspondence with others. In this talk, we will follow the timeline of their mutual encounters and of Haber's changing political attitude in response to the rise of Nazism that nearly culminated in Haber's resettling to Palestine. Who were Chaim Weizmann and Fritz Haber? Well, Chaim Weizmann was a renowned biochemist, a leader of the Zionist movement, and the first president of the State of Israel. Fritz Haber was the discoverer of the catalytic synthesis of ammonia from its elements, hydrogen and nitrogen, apart from his many other achievements. This discovery secured bread from air for humankind, that is, unlimited supply of fertilizer, and enabled population growth from about 1.5 billion then to about 7.8 billion today. Only few scientists have conferred benefits to humankind that are on a par with those that we owe to Fritz Haber. And yet, Haber has been a controversial figure for about the last third of those 150 plus years that elapsed since his birth in 1868. It was Haber's role in World War I, most notably his initiative to usher in chemical warfare to the battlefield, that cast a long shadow over his legacy. Haber was a German Jewish patriot. This meant, in his case, among other things, that after his conversion to Protestantism, he never stopped identifying with Jews or being appalled by anti-Semitism. However, he adopted Theodor Mommsen's credo that Germans were to abandon those loyalties and affiliations that divided them. Zionism was quite foreign to Haber at the time. This photo shows Chaim Weizmann during a press conference towards the end of World War I in his office at what is today the Weizmann Institute of Science in Rehovot. The framed table photos that flank Weizmann and are those of Haber and Richard Willstätter, another prominent German Jewish scientist and Nobel laureate. Now, how come that Haber's photo ended up featured on Weizmann's desk? Moreover, facing the room, as if to provide a shield for Weizmann. I hope my talk today will help answer this question. But before telling you the story of the rapprochement between Haber and Weizmann, let me provide some more context by introducing Weizmann and Haber in more detail. With over 200 patents, mostly for biochemical processes to produce compounds for a wide range of industries, Chaim Weizmann spearheaded the British effort during World War I to mass produce acetone needed for the manufacture of cordite, a smokeless propellant that was used in British ammunitions. Harnessing his scientific reputation and achievements, as well as a persuasive personality, Weizmann was able to entice the British political leadership into recognizing, through the Balfour Declaration, the right of the Jewish people to a national home in the land of Israel, soon to become the British Mandate Palestine. This was, of course, in 1917. An active member of the Zionist movement since the early 20th century, Weizmann was elected after the war president of the World Zionist Organization, a position he held with brief interruptions for more than 20 years. Weizmann focused his efforts on supporting the Jewish community in Palestine by developing ties with the diaspora, as well as on building Jewish academic institutions in Palestine. Among his wide-ranging achievements was the co-founding of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as the establishment of the Daniel Ziv Research Institute in Rehovot, now the Weizmann Institute of Science. After the founding of the State of Israel, to which he contributed in many ways, Weizmann was elected its first president. When he passed away in 1952, thousands of mourners descended upon Rehovot to pay their last respects. Fritz Haber's discovery of the catalytic synthesis of ammonia from its elements in 1909, for which he received the 1918 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, may serve as an apt reminder of the Janus face of science. On one side, bread from air, on the other, gunpowder from air, as ammonia can be oxidized to nitrates, that is, explosives. Moreover, in his patriotic zeal during World War I, Haber became the driving force behind the development of chemical warfare in Germany, poison instead of air. The chlorine cloud attack at Ypres in April 1915 that Haber had orchestrated amounted to the first use of a weapon of mass destruction, and as such marks a tragic turning point in world history. The breadth of Haber's intellectual interests was astounding, ranging from fundamental physics to physical chemistry to physiology. This was reflected in what had become during the Weimar era of Heimer's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. The Institute's exemplary workings even entered the annals of the sociology of science. Likewise, the scope of Haber's organizational activities was immense and included the co-founding of the German counterpart of the National Science Foundation. The German National Science Foundation was founded in 1920, however, the American one 24 years later in 1944. In contrast to many of his colleagues, Haber embraced the Weimar Republic and ranked among its open supporters. Neither his great scientific merits nor his unbridled patriotism sufficed to stave off his loss of status and position once the Nazis rose to power. Haber's Jewish origin, as well as his democratic attitudes, were a thorn in their flesh. Ill and embittered, Haber died in exile less than half a year after being driven out of Germany. During the last months of his life, he espoused liberal Zionism and made preparations for joining Chaim Weizmann's project of building Jewish academic institutions in Palestine. Let me say a little more about the catalytic synthesis of ammonia from its elements. The need to find new ways of replenishing agricultural soil with nitrogen in a form that can be metabolized by plants was articulated in 1898 by William Crookes and was widely perceived as a challenge. In Sir Williams's words, the fixation of atmospheric nitrogen is one of the great discoveries awaiting the genius of chemists. It was one of the most publicized speeches of the time. Some of the most illustrious chemists had a go at fixing nitrogen to hydrogen, that is, at the direct synthesis of ammonia from its elements. Among them were Henri Le Chatelier, William Ramsay, Wilhelm Ostwald, and Walter Nernst. All failed. There were two basic questions to answer, a thermodynamic one and a kinetic one. Without going into any more details, let me say that the answer found by Haber, together with his young collaborator from England, Robert Le Rossignol, to both questions was work at as low a temperature as possible to save the ammonia from thermal decomposition, but use as high a pressure as you can to increase its yield. Drain whatever ammonia you get and recycle the unused nitrogen and hydrogen. In order for the reaction to go quickly enough to sustain the cycle, use an osmium catalyst. In the industrial scale Haber-Bosch process developed by Karl Bosch with his co-workers at the Badische Anilin and Soda Fabrik, BASF, the expensive and rare osmium catalyst was replaced by a cheap and abundant iron catalyst. Haber wondered in 1910 about it. It is remarkable how new special features always come to light. Here iron, with which Ostwald had first worked and which we later tested 100 times in its pure state, is now found to function when impure. End of Haber's quote. What happened was that Bosch and his co-worker Alvin Mitasch made use of Swedish iron ore, which introduced aluminum and potassium as beneficial impurities that acted as promoters of iron's catalytic activity. The elementary steps have been understood only much later through investigations of the surface collision dynamics by Gerhard Ertl and company and other research groups. The catalytic synthesis of ammonia from its elements was a momentous discovery that revolutionized chemical industry, and through its use in production of fertilizers, paved the way for the growth of the world population from the mentioned 1.5 billion in 1900 to about 7.8 billion today. By 1920, the Haber-Bosch process became the dominant means of nitrogen fixation. One could say that it's a cornerstone of organized life on the planet. As shown in the graph, the biosphere is capable of sustaining, I don't know whether my cursor is visible. This is this dashed brown curve. The biosphere is capable of sustaining only about 1/2 of the world's population. The other half can be fed thanks to the Haber-Bosch process. However, about 40% of the food production produced is wasted. In the absence of this wasting, and if people ate reasonable amounts, that is, in the absence of obesity, 6 billion could be fed by the biosphere. The process of converting fixed nitrogen into food is quite inefficient, between 4 and 14%, depending on the kind of food. Hence, much of the reactive ammonia is being dumped into the environment. The environmental impact of producing current levels of reactive nitrogen, about 4 times more than what the biosphere can deal with, leads to the loss of biodiversity, as well as other deleterious effects. Now, let's go back to Haber and Weizmann and introduce the Einstein connection between them. Albert Einstein's arrival in Berlin in 1914 was orchestrated with Haber's help. It made Berlin's academics glitter even shinier. Einstein and Haber developed quickly a close personal relationship. Einstein made use of an office at Haber's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute during 1914-1915 while finalizing his general theory of relativity. According to a local legend, Haber called upon Einstein to do for chemistry what he, Einstein, did for physics. After all, Einstein's first 2 papers and his thesis dealt with molecules. Anyway, here's what Weizmann wrote in his memoirs, Trial and Error, on the Einstein connection. Quote, "It will be remembered that when I made my first trip to America in 1921, I had been fortunate enough to enlist the cooperation of Albert Einstein. I learned later that Haber had done all he could to dissuade Einstein from joining me. Haber said, among other things, that Einstein would be doing untold harm to his career and to the name of the institute of which he was a distinguished member if he threw in his lot with the Zionists, and particularly with such pronounced Zionists as myself. But how accurate was Weizmann's account of Haber's opposition to Einstein's strip as part of the Zionist delegation? Why don't we have a look at the letter that Haber actually wrote to Einstein about it? Quote, "It is the friendship of many years that forces me to write to you today. If at this point in time you ostentatiously fraternize with the English and their friends, the people in Germany will regard it as a proof of the disloyalty of the Jews. So many Jews went into the war, that is World War I, died and ended up in misery without complaining about it because they saw their service as a patriotic duty. Their lives and deaths have not eliminated anti-Semitism, but they have relegated it in the eyes of those who shoulder the honor and greatness of our country to the category of base hatefulness and ignobility. Do you wish to erase through your behavior what German Jews have achieved with their blood and suffering?" End quote. But there was also quite some political context of Haber's letter to Einstein. 5 days earlier, on the 4th of March, 1921, Warren Harding was inaugurated as the 29th US president. Harding's election shattered hopes that the US would continue its attempts made by Harding's predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, to mitigate the harsh and unrealistic terms of the Versailles Treaty, pressed by the British and French governments. Moreover, America was technically still at war with Germany at the time. As during World War I, Haber made Germany's problems his own. In order to alleviate the burden of the war reparation payments mandated by the Versailles Treaty, Haber launched a secret project aimed at extracting gold from seawater on which he plodded for 6 years. Thus, it was the context of the grim political realities of the day and of Haber's personal engagement in easing Germany's predicament that led Haber to write to Einstein. Einstein answered promptly on the same day. Quote, "A few weeks ago, a valued local Zionist visited me to hand over to me a telegram sent by Professor Weizmann, in which the Zionist organization was asking me to join some German and English Zionists on their trip to America to seek counsel on educational matters in Palestine. Despite my international mindset, I feel obliged to stand up for the persecuted and morally oppressed members of my tribe, Stammgenossen, whenever it is somehow in my power. So I cheerfully accepted. Therefore, my participation in the US trip is much more an act of loyalty rather than disloyalty." Well, end quote. Einstein's answer may have been prompt, but it was also a little bit of a non sequitur, for Haber's letter was about the loyalty of the Jews to Germany and not to a Jewish cause. Well, anyway, then Einstein added, "No reasonable person can reproach me for disloyalty to my German friends. I received a number of attractive calls from Switzerland, the Netherlands, Norway, and England, and I turned them all down without even thinking about accepting them. By the way, I didn't do this out of attachment to Germany, but to my dear German friends, of which you, Fritz Haber, are one of the most distinguished and caring. Attachment to Germany's political establishment would be for me, a pacifist, unnatural." On his 2-month tour of America and Britain as member of Weizmann's Zionist delegation, Einstein was treated as a celebrity. He visited also Harvard, where he was greeted by President Lawrence Lowell, a known anti-Semite. He also met the US President Warren Harding. Whether these personal encounters contributed to a German-American thaw, I don't know. However, the peace treaty between Germany and America would be signed shortly thereafter in the summer of 1921. In his speech at the University of Manchester, which bestowed an honorary degree on Einstein, Einstein made use of his celebrity status to urge his audience to help overcome psychological barriers. This is how he called it, psychological barriers between German and British scientists. Back in Berlin, Einstein's success abroad was regarded as homage paid to a German scientist, and he was indeed treated as a German scientist in America and Britain. And no incidents related to Einstein's trip are on record. However, serious incidents followed not long thereafter, as the anti-Semitic and anti-socialist conspiracy theory of a stab in the back was taking hold in Germany. One of the early culminations of the hate campaign it incited was the assassination of Weimar's foreign minister Walter Rathenau in June 1922. Rathenau, a visionary industrialist of Jewish descent, belonged to Haber's and Einstein's circle. In the aftermath of Rathenau's murder, Einstein, heeding the advice of his friends, temporarily left Germany for Asia as a safe haven. Haber and Weizmann met in person 5 times. Let us now recount these personal encounters. Despite many common acquaintances, Haber and Weizmann were introduced to each other in person as late as 1932 by their family members, Joseph Blumenfeld, Weizmann's brother-in-law. He owned the chemistry company Société de Produits Chimiques des Terres Rares, based in Paris, and Hermann Haber, the son of Fritz and Clara Haber, who worked for Blumenfeld's firm as a chemist. At their amicable meeting in London, Haber was still the omnipotent German Geheimrat, Privy Councillor, while Weizmann, a British subject, was the leader of the Zionist movement. A year earlier, however, Weizmann was temporarily voted out of office as president of the World Zionist Organization. Disappointed by the disapproval of his liberal political leadership, Weizmann concentrated on establishing a new biochemistry research institute in the town of Rehovot in Palestine, with the support of the British Zionist sympathizers Israel and Rebecca Zief. They wanted their institute to be named for their son Daniel. This was far from a mere distraction for Weizmann. As Fritz Stern put it, quote, "For most liberals at the time, science was an unquestioned good, the fullest expression of human reason and human genius, an obvious instrument of human progress." At their London meeting, Weizmann found to his surprise Haber extremely affable, and he outlined his project in Rehovot to Haber, whereupon Haber invited Weizmann to visit him at his Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Here is how Weizmann described his visit in Berlin. Quote, "It was a magnificent collection of laboratories, superbly equipped and many-sided in its program, and Haber was enthroned as dictator. He was not only hospitable, he was actually interested in my work in Palestine. Frequently in our conversation on technical matters, he would throw in the words, 'Well, Dr. Weizmann, you might try to introduce that in Palestine.' In fact, Weizmann was impressed end quote. Weizmann was impressed by what he saw in Berlin to the extent that he decided to model what was to become the Daniel Zief Research Institute on Haber's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. In a subsequent letter, Haber thanked Weizmann for his visit. He also provided some advice on acquisition of research chemicals. Quite striking about this letter is what it does not mention, namely the looming political catastrophe in Germany. This is alluded to only in the following letter that Haber sent to Weizmann in May 1933 from Munich, where he was visiting his bosom friend, Richard Willstätter. Although Haber did not explicitly mention his own predicament under the Nazis, he noted that Willstätter was reluctant to even consider moving out of Munich. And a predicament it was. With the Nazis at the helm, Germany was done with the Jew Haber, in the words of Bernhard Rust, the infamous Minister of Culture and Education. Nazi Minister of Culture and Education. Haber became a persona non grata under the Nazis, who would deny him credit for anything they considered admirable, including, ironically, Haber's involvement in chemical warfare. After the promulgation of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933, Haber found himself under the obligation to dismiss all his co-workers of Jewish descent. Haber soon realized that what remained for him to do was to help to secure a future abroad for his people and to quit. Haber handed in his resignation on the 30th of April, 1933, with these memorable words. My sense of tradition requires of me that I only choose staff members according to their professional abilities and character without regard to their racial makeup. This letter amounted to burning bridges. Max Planck made an attempt at saving Haber's institute by pleading with Minister Rust, and after being turned down, by asking Hitler in person to intercede. But this was to no avail. According to Planck's testimony that he provided shortly after 1945, Hitler concluded the audience by a fit of rage worthy of a furious Führer. Haber became just another Jew in Germany. By mid-1933, Haber's attempts to help junior Jewish scientists to find employment abroad was already in full swing. Providing such help would be one of Haber's main preoccupations until his death 8 months later. Haber would also provide financial assistance to the suddenly unemployed members of his Kaiser Wilhelm Institute from his private Haber Fund. Several of them, such as the scientists Adalbert and Vladislav Farkas, and the secretaries Rita Krakauer and Irene Zakur, would emigrate to Palestine. Let me mention one more irony. In 1940, Nazis managed actually to award the honorary title National Science National. It's so silly that I'm unable to remember it. He turned Haber's Institute into a model national socialist enterprise, and as Musterbetrieb, it was the only academic institution in Germany that actually was honored by this title. Haber was also in negotiation on his own behalf, among others with the French Minister of Education, Anatole de Monzy, about a position in Paris, and with Frederick Donnan and Sir Harold Hartley, both research fellowships in London and Oxford. In the fall of 1933, Haber would join, however, Sir William Pope at Cambridge University. Sir William worked for the British Chemical Warfare Service in World War I, and it was him who developed a new synthesis of mustard gas for the Entente. From his hotel in Cambridge, Haber would write to Pope the following lines, quote, "My most important goals in life are that I not die as a German citizen and that I not bequeath to my children and grandchildren the civil rights of second-class citizenship, as German law now demands. The second thing that's important to me is to spend my last years in a scientific community with honor, but without heavy duties." But we are not quite yet in Cambridge. On his way to a UPAC meeting in Spain, Haber made a stopover in Paris to see Weizmann again. They met on the 10th of August in the presence of Willstätter and Weizmann's assistant, Ernst Bergmann. This was a key moment in Haber's new life in exile, as Weizmann laid out his detailed plans for the Ziv Institute and offered both Haber and Willstätter leading positions there. In his autobiography, Weizmann recollects the circumstances and the way he extended his invitation to Haber. Quote, "I found Haber broken, muddled, moving about in a mental and moral vacuum. The shock had been too great. He had occupied too high a position in Germany. His fall was therefore all the harder to bear. I began to talk to him then about coming out to us in Palestine, but did not press the matter. I wanted him first to take a rest, recover from his shock, and treat his illness, angina pectoris, in a suitable climate." In addition, Weizmann offered Haber to make use of his connections at the British Foreign Office to help Haber to get out of Germany without having to pay the emigration tax. Haber wanted to see the place and the people first and offered to visit Rehovot at the beginning of 1934. However, what he was apparently most eager to know was Einstein's opinion about the whole matter. Still from Paris, Haber wrote to Einstein to update him about his situation, pleaded with him to make peace with Weizmann, and made a confession. "I never felt so Jewish as now." Upon his arrival at the UPAC meeting in Santander, Haber received Einstein's reply, a terrible letter, as he characterized it to his son Hermann, that showed that the apocalypse of mistrust among the Jews has not only begun, but was far advanced. Apart from expressing satisfaction that Haber's love for the blonde beast has cooled off a little, Einstein's letter teemed with sarcasms aimed at both Weizmann and the Hebrew University and further exacerbated Haber's misgivings about moving to Palestine. Drawing on the unqualifiedly positive attitude of Haber's trusted friend, James Frank, towards Weizmann, Haber set aside Einstein's advice to keep away from Palestine and wrote a friendly letter to Weizmann from a stopover in Basel on his way to Berlin. However, the next day, upon learning that Weizmann was vacationing in Zermatt, Haber decided to pay him a visit, ignoring the warnings of his doctors that he should avoid high altitudes because of his heart condition. Haber's high-altitude visit with Weizmann was happening against the background of the 18th Congress of the World Zionist Organization that was held in Prague. As Weizmann explains in his memoirs, he did not intend to attend the Congress despite the importance of Jews to speak in one voice during the crisis brought about by the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. Quote, "I had refused to attend the Congress, not wishing to be involved in any political struggle. During the dinner, phone calls came from Prague and frantic requests that I leave Zermatt at once and betake myself to the Congress. I persisted in my refusal, and though I said nothing to Haber about the reason for these frequent interruptions, except to mention that they came from Prague, he guessed their purport from something he read in the papers. And he said to me with the utmost earnestness," now Haber speaking, "Dr. Weizmann, I was one of the mightiest men in Germany. I was more than a great army commander, more than a captain of industry. I was the founder of industries. My work was essential for the economic and military expansion of Germany. All doors were open to me. But the position which I occupied then, glamorous as it may have seemed, is as nothing compared with yours. You are not creating out of plenty. You are creating out of nothing in a land which lacks everything. You are trying to restore a derelict people to a sense of dignity, and you are, I think, succeeding. At the end of my life, I find myself a bankrupt. When I'm gone and forgotten, your work will stand a shining monument in the long history of our people. Do not ignore the call now. Go to Prague, even at the risk that you will suffer grievous disappointment there." End quote. Haber's speech in Zermatt is often quoted, but seldom with the point about the significance that he attributed to Weizmann's work. It's usually used to actually compromise Haber as a vain man, absurdly. Anyway, Weizmann did not go to Prague, much to Haber's disappointment, but he took the opportunity to press upon Haber his invitation to come out to Palestine and work with him. Weizmann said to Haber, "The climate will be good for you. You will find a modern laboratory and able assistants. You will work in peace and honor. It will be a return home for you, your journey's end." Weizmann recorded in his autobiography that Haber accepted with enthusiasm and asked only that he be allowed to spend another month or two in a sanitarium. Very unfortunately, upon leaving Zermatt, Haber suffered a heart attack and remained confined to a sanitarium in Switzerland for 2 months. From the sanitarium, Haber wrote to Weizmann, quote, "No more will I ride up to the elevation of 1,600 meters and then down from there again, but I am glad that my last mountain trip has given me the opportunity to meet you and your wife, as well as to see for the first time in my life the Matterhorn, which occupies a very special place among mountains, as you do among men. I kindly request your permission to stay in touch with you with regard to Palestine and to the eventual help that I may need in order to be able to extricate myself from Germany." After a partial recovery, Haber, accompanied by his stepsister Elsa, traveled to Cambridge in early November 1933 to join William Pope. Weizmann did his best to support Haber during the time in Cambridge. Upon Haber's arrival there, Weizmann wrote the following: "I somehow feel that you are perhaps a little bit uneasy during these first few days in Cambridge, and I would like you to know how much I understand and sympathize with you. The first few days in strange surroundings are always difficult, but I'm sure that feeling will pass very soon, and that you will shortly be finding the atmosphere and a congenial and friendly one in which you can carry on your work under really happy conditions." Weizmann started implementing plans for Haber's arrival in Rehovot. The plans included setting up Haber's laboratory and finding a suitable accommodation for him. Weizmann was able to report to Haber on the progress achieved. "I'm happy to inform you that the outer shell of the building is ready and the people there are beginning with the inner outfit. I'm assured that the laboratory will be in working order on January 1st, so that if we all get there during December, we shall find a great deal to do. I have instructed Palestine to look for accommodation and would be glad to know approximately what accommodation you will require. Will you be taking some of your library with you, and will your sister and your secretary be accompanying you?" Haber, in his letters, continued expanding on the plans for his move to Palestine, his poor health, and his financial concerns, while extolling Weizmann's achievements. Haber also ventured to recommend Ladislaus Farkas as his most suitable assistant and potential successor should Haber assume the chair of physical chemistry at the Hebrew University. During his nearly 3 months stay in Cambridge, Haber had been visited by many of his former co-workers and colleagues, among them Michael Polanyi, Paul Hartek, Max Born, Ladislaus Farkas. A happy moment was a colloquium given by Haber's Berlin co-workers in his room at the University Arms Hotel. As Haber's former chief of staff, as he was dubbed, Hartmut Kallmann recalled, a scientific discussion unfolded more wonderful than you can imagine. In addition to all the activities reflected in his correspondence, Haber worked very hard on his science in Cambridge. He wrote there his last paper on catalytic decomposition of hydrogen peroxide with his Berlin assistant, Joseph Weiss. A paragon of thoroughness and ingenuity, 19 printed pages long. According to Haber's stepsister Elsa, it cost Haber the last ounce of his strength. The paper had to be heavily edited as its English was not up to speed. In his key letter of January 6, 1934 to Weizmann, Haber made clear on the one hand that he will not be able to come to Palestine in the near future, and on the other, that he has embraced the Zionist cause. As for his inability to come, Haber informed Weizmann about the lack of progress concerning his emigration from Germany and his deteriorating health. Quote, meanwhile, the condition of my heart is changing with the coming winter and increasing anxiety, and the thought that seemed self-evident to me, namely that I could take off for and reach Palestine in order to recuperate, is now changed due to my state of health into its very opposite. As for Haber's embrace of Zionism, here are his reflections he offered to Weizmann. Quote, in truth, I do not envy you your great project. I feel with increasing urgency every day that only those things are worth doing that we venture to do out of a higher consideration. The German Jews feel closer to the German state than to Zionism and live without the purity and simplicity of a spiritual direction of their own. Since Hitler's economic policy was met with success, the days of the Jewish prophets faded in the fog of a forgotten past, and the overrating of a physically bearable existence has moved into the foreground of their interests again. The Russian Jews are ahead of us because they suffered during the days when in Germany we were seeking honor and respect. If the Americans recover economically, they will become Zionists again, as they had been before the Hitler days. But if their system of private capitalism fails, Palestine will have to make its ascent not with the help of American means, but in accordance with Bismarck's dictum, by means of blood and iron. I'm writing all this not as an opinion of a man who feels responsible, but from the perspective of the age that the year 1933 has bestowed on me, and with the wish to be as useful to you as my strength allow, and with my best wishes for your success and the well-being of your family, that has instilled a feeling of true friendship in my tired soul. The harsh English winter 1933-34 took a toll on Haber's fragile health, and so on advice of his family and doctor, he decided to go south. Before his departure from Cambridge, Haber wrote a letter addressed to the vice-chancellor of the university, in which he stressed that the chivalry from King Arthur's time still lived among English scientists, and expressed a strong hope to return. At his time of humility and contrition, Haber also drafted his testament. In it, he expressed his wish to be buried alongside his first wife, Clara, who committed suicide at age 45 in 2015. Haber departed from Cambridge on the 26th of January 1934. During a break in London the same day, he made Weizmann for the fifth and last time. Haber's son Hermann and Weizmann's brother-in-law Joseph Blumenfeld were also present, as in the first meeting between Haber and Weizmann in London less than 2 years earlier. Not much is known about what was discussed at the meeting. Haber was weak and exhausted, and Weizmann must have realized that Haber would not be able to join him in Palestine anytime soon. Following their final meeting, Haber took off for Orsalina in southern Switzerland. At a stopover in Basel, he was joined by his son Hermann and his wife Marga, as well as by Rudolf Stern and his wife. Here is a recollection of Rudolf Stern's, who acted at the time as Haber's personal physician. Quote, Haber more or less ignored his anginal pain, which grew steadily worse when the rough English winter set in. A stepsister Elsa's entreaties to go south were in vain, although they were supported by frequent letters from his son Hermann and from me. Only when he had completed his paper with Joseph Weiss did he agree to go to the sanitarium in Orsalina. He asked the young Habers and us to meet him in Basel. This we did on the morning of January 29, 1934. When he and his sister arrived at the hotel, all of us were frightened by the terrible change in his appearance. He was not able to talk for even a few minutes without experiencing severe angina. Haber passed away as a result of heart failure in the evening of the same day, that is the 29th of January 1934, in his hotel room at Hotel Euler in Basel. Haber was buried in Basel. In accordance with his will, Clara's ashes were reburied beside his. Let me note that it was in Basel where the first Congress of the World Zionist Organization, founded by Theodor Herzl, took place in 1897 in the building on the left. Herzl acted on his conviction that, quote, anti-Semitism cannot be defeated or cured, it can only be avoided. When Weizmann learned of Haber's passing, he sent the following telegram to Haber's son Hermann. Deeply shocked and distressed by the sad news of your father's death, science and humanity lose in him one of their greatest sons. And Einstein would note in a letter to Hermann, Haber's was the tragedy of the German Jew, the tragedy of unrequited love. On April 3rd, 1934, the Daniel Zief Research Institute was inaugurated with Weizmann as its founding director. Richard Willstetter gave the inaugural speech in which he extolled Weizmann's accomplishments and remembered his friend Haber. A key practical point. Fritz Haber's secretary of 16 years, Rita Krakauer, described as the soul and memory of Haber's Institute, was hired by Weizmann as his secretary for the Daniel Zief Institute. It must have been of tremendous practical advantage to have someone around who knew everything about how to administer a research institute. The next day, on the 4th of April, a cornerstone was laid to the Institute's library building. The new library building would provide a home for Fritz Haber's book collection bequeathed to the Zief Institute by Hermann. The library of the Zief Institute was named after Fritz Haber and inaugurated on the second anniversary of Haber's death on the 29th of January 1936. This building no longer exists. Today, the Fritz Haber book collection is a part of the main library of the Weizmann Institute of Science and consists of science classics from Haber's time, often with a personal inscription by the author. In 1949, the Daniel Zief Institute was renamed after Chaim Weizmann. In 1952, Haber's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was renamed after Fritz Haber. Because of Haber's principled attitude towards the Nazis and the banishment that he had to suffer as a result, there was a strong anti-Nazi component to the renaming. Moreover, the renaming of the institute after Haber signaled that Haber's affection for his country was not unrequited after all. Nowadays, Weizmann's office in Rehovot is a historic site. The photos of Haber and Willstätter are still there and reveal how much Weizmann valued the memory of these two men. The research on the relationship between Haber and Weizmann was done in collaboration with Dr. Tom Bielik, a graduate of the Weizmann Institute of Science, the visitor to Berlin. This photo shows Tom working as a volunteer guide at the Institute during his student days. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Bretislav, do you know in any of these discussions of Zionism and setting up this new nation that the issue of the Palestinians was mentioned?
I am aware that the issue of the indigenous population was an issue, certainly for Einstein, and I'm aware that he had a big falling out with Weizmann, in part about this issue, but I don't know, I'm not privy to any of the details.
Yeah, because it seems there's a very interesting parallel with the creation of the United States, when the issue of slavery was just overlooked and postponed.
Mm-hmm.
And that problem is still with us today. And now that's a growing problem in Israel. It seems ironic that history repeats itself this way.
Yes, Einstein made also many apt comments exactly along these lines.
Not just slavery, of course. We did have our own indigenous population.
Yeah, I think that's
more
relevant.
I also don't know when Einstein made peace with Weizmann again, and when when he decided to bequeath all his intellectual and physical property to the Hebrew University. There must have been a breaking point, but that's a question for an Einsteinologist.
And another question I have about Haber was apparently he never expressed regrets over having created chemical warfare. How do you think he dealt with that problem?
Thank you for this question. It's a very good one. Actually, during World War I, chemical warfare was used, of course, by both sides, by the Central Powers as well as by the Entente. And it was referred to by ammunition and military experts actually as humane, as perverse as it may sound. So chemical warfare was considered to be humane because, based on some kind of silly analysis of the number of dead and so on. And the real outrage about chemical warfare is a relatively recent phenomenon. I think from the 1960s, when chemical warfare was reassessed, or chemical weapons were reassessed as weapons of mass destruction. There was also an earlier strongly antagonistic reaction to chemical warfare by artists in the 1920s and 30s, in particular Otto Dix, Georg Gross, and others. But remarkably, the reaction of the public to chemical warfare during World War I was not outrage.
Interesting. I'm gonna jump over to the chat for a second. Jenny Rickland had a comment that I just want to restate it for everyone because I think it reflects all of us. Fascinating look into this important time period, and a thank you. Jerry Slate had a question. Was general travel by the German Jewish scientists restricted in the 30s? And then Stephen, we're going to get back to your question after that.
Whether the travel of German Jewish scientists was restricted? Well, it was restricted out of Germany through this emigration tax up to a certain point.
So it was just an economic.
It was of course also limited by the consideration of many Jewish people. Including members of my family. They just could not believe that the Germans would do what they were doing, what the Nazis were doing, and therefore they stayed put and had to pay the heaviest price.
So if I understand what you're saying, it was the joint effect of the confiscation of wealth and the imposition of the tax that essentially restricted any migration.
I wouldn't say it restricted any migration, but it restricted it to some extent. I don't have any quantitative data on this. I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's left with the people who are no longer here.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, your question, please. You're muted.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I had a question, but first I wanted to say I really appreciate your approach. I think so often when we do history, history of science and history in general, we reduce human characters to an outcome, and we want to classify them as good or bad. But I really like the way you looked at the relationship. I think that's a fantastic approach because you really capture the dynamic and the struggle with each of them. And I was curious if you thought that if Haber had an effect on Weizmann. I mean, it's pretty clear you can kind of see Weizmann in context, with the powerful effect it had on Haber. But what about the other way?
I don't know to what extent Haber influenced Weizmann morally or in terms of his worldview. I doubt that there was a very big influence there. But he hugely influenced him scientifically, and as a high-level scientific manager, that is the founder of the Hebrew University and of the Weizmann Institute of Science.
I love that note about the Krakauer. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, she was highly acclaimed, and interestingly, she stayed with Weizmann only until 1948, and then she moved to England. She got married and moved to England. She married an Englishman, and so she was no longer available as his secretary when he became president of Israel.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you very much.
One other comment, Mike Alexander said, during World War I, artillery and machine guns were extremely destructive. I think they were the objects of horror.
I think that's completely correct. Yes, there was so much horror. Chemical warfare exacerbated the horrors. It frightened people. They didn't know what to expect. There were innovations in chemical warfare. A mustard gas, a very nasty agent, was introduced as late as 1917. And in fact, this was a brainchild of Haber's. It wasn't, really killing people. It was just did terrible things to them. And he pleaded with the general command not to actually deploy mustard gas unless the general command was sufficiently certain that they will win the war very quickly, because Harbour wanted to avoid a situation when the Entente would retaliate in kind, which actually happened. Also thanks to Pope.
Charlie.
Well, I think it's extremely interesting. As I recall, Haber made a very clear rationalization that anything that would shorten the war was going to be justified, and that he thought that gas warfare might do that. And it's very similar to the arguments made for the atomic bomb. And in fact, you have the same classes of rationalization, those for and those against, but of course, in the case of the gases, it didn't work because there was time to retaliate. In the case of the atomic bomb, we were probably all extremely fortunate that there was no capacity for retaliation.
Yes, well, militarily, from the military point of view, World War I suffered from the stalemate of trench warfare, and breaking the stalemate was, of course, something that everybody was aiming at. Also with the idea of shortening the war and reducing the casualties. The war was supposed to last for only 3 months, right, to begin with. But thank you for bringing up the analogy with the Manhattan Project. Actually, there is a very important point which is hardly known. It was actually the French who used ethyl bromoacetate deployed via rifle grenades already in August 1914. They used it in the War of the Frontiers, right at the beginning of World War I. And so, of course, the other side was entitled to think, okay, so now they are using this. What are they going to use next? We better prepare for this. And Haber provided a testimonial about this before a parliamentary committee in 1923. And there was an investigation which confirmed his testimonial. So, it can be taken for a fact. Also, historians have confirmed it in the meantime that this was really true.
Dr. Friedrich, was the French chemical, was that a poison or just a debilitating agent?
No, it was not a tear gas or anything of that sort. Ethyl bromoacetate is a lethal chemical that causes terrible death. And the reason why actually it had not become known or remained completely ineffective was that it was not deployed, let me use the term, in a competent way. The concentration achieved was way too low to have any effects. Yeah. So that was the difference. So the difference in the end was between the incompetent and the competent use. Yeah. Of course, the Entente learned how to deploy chemical weapons competently very quickly after the attack at Ypres in April 1915.
Just my own personal curiosity, which is a little bit off the subject. Gas masks were invented at the same time, and as a result of this?
They were just getting ready for this, the Germans, and they were developing gas masks actually simultaneously. Haber's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was converted into a center for the development of chemical weapons and of protective measures against them. And Haber's bosom friend, Richard Willstätter, he was unwilling to participate in the development of chemical weapons, but he was perfectly willing to work on gas masks.
How much did Haber and Pope work together after they got together in England? What sorts of activities did they carry out? What kind of scientific investigations did they do?
I don't think that they worked together at all. Haber spent there not even 3 months, and he was working very hard on this paper with his assistant Josef Weiss on the catalytic decomposition of hydrogen peroxide. So Pope was just kind enough to provide lab space and material, I presume, and his kind auspices, and I think that was all. I don't know very much about the personal relationship between Pope and Haber. I do happen to know a little more about the relationship between Harold Hartley and Haber. Hartley held a similar position during World War I like Haber did in Germany. And there is an anecdote about their meeting after the war. Hartley visited Haber at his institute and had a very congenial conversation, and then they started joking. And Haber asked him rhetorically, "Do you know what's the difference between the two of us?" And Hartley said no, and Haber said, "Well, you were promoted to the rank of brigadier general, whereas I was just a captain." It's true. By the way, interesting, talking about anti-Semitism and such things. So it was very exceptional that Haber, as a Jew, received an officer's rank during World War I. However, there was a snub included in it. Normally, university professors who received a military rank in the German military, they were promoted to at least a major. But Haber was just a captain. So, yeah.
I'm unmuted now. I said I was commenting to you is I think there's a book that's germinating in the back of your mind about this subject.
Are you asking whether there is something written on this? Yes,
I'm asking if you plan on writing something more on this.
I have written actually a paper on this with Tom Bielik, and I sent it intentionally to the Israel Journal of Chemistry. That's a Wiley journal, where it was very well received, I must say. And they also made sure that the paper be republished in a shortened version in what amounts to the Israel counterpart of the Chemical and Engineering News. I think it's called the Israel Chemist and Engineer. So it was published twice, actually, in Israel.
Since I invited Bretislav to talk, I would like to take the opportunity to thank him for coming and giving us this talk on behalf of the whole group. Thank you, Bretislav.
Thank you so much. Thank you.